Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're going to start off today's show by discussing the U.S. and its wish for the arms embargo on Iran to be extended indefinitely through the United Nations Security Council. We'll be presenting a resolution to that effect next week. It's been announced by Brian Hook, who is on the way out. He's the U.S. Special Envoy, for Iran. He'll be replaced very soon by Abrams, who is currently the U.S. Special Envoy for Venezuela. Nevertheless, U.S. allies and those other signatories to the nuclear deal are against this U.S. goal of extending the arms embargo indefinitely, fearing that essentially this would be the final nail in the coffin, in the view of the Iranians at least, when it comes to the nuclear deal. And also there is then this argument by the U.S. that if this resolution does not pass at the UN Security Council, that it will then invoke the snapback mechanism. That's a mechanism within the nuclear deal which allowed any party within the deal. Now, you remember that, of course, the U.S. did walk away from the deal. It withdrew unilaterally, one remembers, when Donald Trump became president. The other allies say that the U.S. cannot invoke the snapback mechanism because it's now not technically a party to it anymore. The U.S., though, argues that within the UN structure, it can still do so, and that very much remains in the bone of contention at this time. If that snapback mechanism does come back into place, that does also then essentially mean that the deal is over because all sanctions would snap back into place on Iran at that time. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Stephen Hurst, who is a reader in politics and the head of the Department of History, Politics and Philosophy at Manchester Metropolitan University. He's also the author of The United States and the Iranian Nuclear Program, as well as 4 other books on U.S. foreign policy. He's joining us now from Manchester in the U.K. Stephen, thank you for your time today. What do you make of this doomed resolution? Essentially, we pretty much know it will not pass at the UN Security Council. Does that then essentially mean that either way it's a lose-lose situation for the nuclear deal, snapback or this resolution?
I don't think that's necessarily the case. The idea that if the resolution doesn't pass, which it won't, I think that's pretty clear, that the snapback is then inevitable, it is not the case. I think we can be pretty confident that the resolution won't pass. But I think we can also be pretty confident that actually the US will not then be able to invoke the snapback sanctions. Someone described this as the US equivalent of Schrodinger's cat, that they could somehow be a participant in the deal and not a participant in the deal at the same time. I don't think anybody takes that seriously, apart from them, the Israelis and maybe the Saudis. And so I don't think they will be in a position, they won't get the support needed to re-invoke the snapback sanctions, and other countries will not join in imposing those sanctions. So it won't happen. It's not what does happen, given that neither of those things occurs, is an interesting question, but I don't think it's an either or in terms of those two.
Now, what does this mean then for the U.S. ability to hurt the nuclear program? I mean, it is still a very powerful country around the world. It can still very much muddy the waters when it comes to the nuclear deal, can't it?
I think it can. I mean, I think it's always difficult with the Trump administration to understand exactly what motivates its actions. But clearly, one explanation, which at some levels almost feels slightly conspiratorial, but given the nature of this administration is perhaps not actually that silly at all, is to see this in part, this move in part, as really about trying to make it impossible for an incoming Biden administration, which looks quite likely at this point in time to happen, to make it impossible for that administration to return to the JCPOA, to the nuclear deal, after January 2021. That it's quite possible that the US or the Trump administration understands that it isn't going to get either the snapback or the resolution. But nevertheless, it's hoping somehow to provoke Iran into pulling further away from the deal, which will make it even harder for restoration of the JCPOA after January 2021. And that might well be a significant part of the Trump administration's thinking, I think.
And so how devastating would it be then, right? Because increasingly we are now talking about, the collapse of this deal in some fashion or another going forward. I mean, the Europeans, to their credit, even though the Iranians would probably argue with this statement of mine, have tried in some small ways at least to try to, keep this going through Instex and the recent Swiss humanitarian corridor as well that sent medicines and other aid to Iran. Do you think that this will create a more dangerous Middle East? I mean, a region which is already very volatile.
Yes, absolutely. I'm not sure that the deal is necessarily doomed. I agree that it's even, there's a kind of glib view, which is somehow if Biden gets in, the Americans can just walk back into the deal and it can all be restored. And it's clearly not anything like that simple. The Iranians have taken a number of steps away from the deal incrementally in response to the Trump administration's actions. There has been a kind of game of chicken going on between the US and Iran, with each side escalating over the last 2 years, which has progressively damaged the deal. It will therefore take quite a lot to put it back together. But the Iranians have said that every step they've taken to this point is reversible if the Americans are prepared to return. So it's not straightforward. It's not straightforward because also there's domestic political issues on both sides, which make it difficult to walk back from where each side has got to. So it may well collapse, but it's not beyond the bounds of possibility that it can be restored if there is a change of administration in the United States in November. But if there isn't, then if the deal can't be restored, then it becomes problematic. It's not necessarily the case that even if the deal collapses, the Chinese and the Russians are somehow going to start sending the Iranians whatever arms they want and fueling an arms race in the Middle East, because it's not in their interest to do so. So it's not necessarily disastrous. It doesn't mean everything falls to pieces, but it becomes a lot more ambiguous, a lot more uncertain, a lot more unclear, for sure.
And as a final word, and I wonder what you think are the lessons that both the Americans and the rest of the international community should learn from this, right? Because the Iranians have argued, as you well know, that this shows that, okay, if we sign a deal with one administration, it's not necessary that the next administration will respect that. And what does that then say about the U.S. establishment? And then, of course, other parties around the world will then be viewing this, right? Firstly, we now have other countries, even U.S. allies, standing up to it and saying, okay, you can't do this, i.e. snapback or the arms embargo indefinitely being extended, and B, they're just not going to trust the U.S. as much anymore?
Yes, I think that this is a point that I've seen made elsewhere, and I think it's absolutely right that it's really not. It depends which American you are, I suppose. The Trump administration and people on the Republican right clearly don't really care about the United Nations. They see the United Nations as a sort of liberal internationalist conspiracy and an obstruction of America's abilities to exercise its virtuous power unilaterally. But if you're not of that state of mind, if you're not of that perspective, then which is actually the vast majority of Americans, then this is very self-defeating. The resolution, the snapback sanctions, was actually a very significant achievement in lots of ways, in the way that it imposed constraints on actors. It set a very useful precedent for the United States in terms of ways that might enable them to constrain China and Russia and their behavior in the United Nations in future. And to rip that up in what is essentially a futile exercise, which is not going to achieve anything, is really, well, it's not hard to understand given this administration, but it's clearly a bad idea, and one which is not going to serve the United States well in the long term.
Indeed. Well, we'll leave there as a final word, but we do sincerely appreciate you taking your time out of your busy schedule to speak to us today and you're sharing thoughts with us. That was Stephen Hurst speaking to us there from Manchester. Next week, we do have the United States, which is going to present this resolution at the UN Security Council. It will quite likely not pass. What will the U.S. do next? Will it try to snap back all those sanctions on Iran, and will the other countries allow for that? Even if the U.S. is somehow able to wiggle that snapback mechanism, does that necessarily mean all the other countries will actually even respect the U.S. wishes? Will they just go beyond the U.S. and say, you know what, we're still going to do business with Iran in some way or the other? A lot of countries seemingly have tried to keep this deal going, the Russians and the Chinese certainly, but even the Europeans also have tried their best, in some certain ways, even though, as I said, the Iranians would argue that point as well, saying the Europeans haven't done enough. But nevertheless, it seems that everyone wants this deal to survive, except the Americans. The Americans have been the one, the Trump administration more specifically has been the one from the get-go, which has wanted this deal gone, as well as, of course, the Israelis and a couple of other countries in the region as well. So we're going to keep a close eye, of course, on how that vote goes and what exactly happens right after that. I'll be back with my next segment after this. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment of today's show, we're going to discuss Russia as well as Iranian possible interference in the U.S. elections. We know that certain Russian and Iranian citizens, I should say, pardon me, have received text messages in Persian and Russian, respectively, offering up to $10 million as a reward for information about hacking activities by their respective countries, of course, in the U.S. elections, which are coming up in November of this year. And now, there's so many issues to unravel here, right? We know that the issue of Russian election meddling is one that's long-standing now, ever since the election of Donald Trump, more specifically. And of course, there's been that case put forth of Russia collusion. It didn't really go through to prove collusion on the part of Russia with Trump to make him win. But nevertheless, that is an issue which came up at that time, back in 2016. Do we think that the Russians and the Iranians would really want to influence the elections in the United States? And if so, does that mean no other country in the world, even U.S. allies? And we may, for example, point out at the Israelis. Do they not want to either influence U.S. elections in a way which would be advantageous for them, to have good policies for them as well in place? Is this really as out of the blue as we may think? And of course, the tactics and all of the above can, of course, be argued and debated. But nevertheless, on the other side, then there's the issue of, does the U.S. ever meddle in other countries' elections as well? So again, as I said, a lot to unravel. Let me put that now to our panelist who is joining us this morning from Atlanta, Georgia. We're joined by Demetrius, a.k.a. Dean Snell Jr., who is a former Texas elected official, campaign speechwriter, and policy writer. He's worked for 9 years now as a secondary English educator, and his weekly podcast, Unpacking Politics with Dean, covers relevant political topics. Dean, thank you for your time this morning. What do you make of those text messages, right, to Iranians and Russians? I don't know, the moment I heard of that, I thought that if those countries had done the exact opposite and sent text messages to Americans about meddling in their respective politics, I imagine that would have been received very differently. What are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. Yes, seeing the text messages, I was truly shocked, especially being that it, according to the information, it was something that was given by Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State. So me seeing that, it kind of shocked me a little bit, and it kind of goes to, because unlike many other countries, America is one of those countries where we know our government has done some foul things when it comes to meddling in other people's elections and doing things out of the ordinary. But it's interesting to see it and hear it coming from the Secretary of State, like out in the open. I'm pretty sure most of the time, a lot of stuff probably does come from the United States to talk to people from other countries to see what's going on, but it's never been like broadly put out there.
On point of lobbying the U.S. government, right, or lobbying political candidates, presidential candidates, I should be more specific. Do you think that that's odd at all for any country around the world to be doing? I mean, at the end of the day, the U.S. is still a superpower of sorts and wields a lot of influence around the world. I mean, it makes sense for countries to be lobbying presidential candidates?
It doesn't make sense. I'm a firm believer in staying out of other people's election. We have a huge argument going on here now in the United States with Russia meddling in our election, and many people feel that the president right now, Donald Trump, has been influenced by Russians, as well as, in some cases, some people believe by other countries like China or just anybody who has had invested interest in this president. And it's going down the line to where people are starting to think that other Republican politicians have been influenced by foreign nations. This isn't the first time that many people in the United States, we look at American history when it came to the communist country versus the American government back in the 50s, 60s, people thought that, or the way to get people to not be a viable candidate was to call them a communist. So we see in the United States of America that other countries meddling with politicians isn't a good look. This is the first time that we've seen where the American government and the American defense and intelligence community has specifically said that other countries have meddled in the elections, and the United States president was okay with it. That is something that is unheard of. Usually, when we find out that a country has meddled in our election, there is sanctions put on them, and there's things that's done, because in the United States, that's something that we do not tolerate as a country. It's other countries meddling in our elections, and other countries even meddling inside of with our technology.
Yeah. Dean, wouldn't an easier solution, or the easiest solution possibly, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, be to just lessen how much is spent on these campaigns? As you well know, every presidential election, candidates spend exponentially more than were spent in the previous elections for advertising and all sorts of other things. And lobbyists as well for different interest groups, be they corporations or even other countries, mind you, do also spend significantly more than they did in previous times. Why not just, make that amount and those red lines and limits a lot less and tighten those screws?
Well, that's something that many after the 2016 election, that's something that many people had issues with, and people were talking about that in 2016 with the influx of money that goes into elections. It's like, where does all of this money go to? Because a lot of the times, millions of dollars is sent into these campaigns, and not all of it is spent. Or where does it go? We have finance. We have people that delve into the finances of what these politicians do with the money, but not in every case things are as we like to say over here, everything isn't put into the forefront. So sometimes things are hidden. One of the other reasons why you have so much money that's pumped into campaigns is not specifically the campaign, but it's to get those air times and commercial times. A lot of the American networks charge a lot of money. So, the one way to do that is we have to specifically, I guess you could say, regulate. And people in America don't like to hear the word regulate as well. No one wants to regulate how much money can be spent, networks spend, because then that goes against the capitalistic society that America has going on at this present moment.
All right, before I let Dean, I wanted to get your final thoughts about, in these specific upcoming elections, right? There's a lot of talk of whether or not every time now we have elections, especially since the election of Donald Trump, this will divide American society further, right? Because now we already have this shadow cast, right, on Donald Trump about Russia collusion. And of course, there are people pro and against that argument, certainly. But nevertheless, in these upcoming elections, if these arguments of the Russians, the Iranians, and others possibly interfering in these elections are already starting, that very well might cast a shadow on whoever wins in November.
It really will cast a shadow. I think a lot of doubt has come into American politics and the way the American government runs now, because of what happened with the election in 2016 and how we saw Russia releasing information from campaigns, personal emails. And just yesterday, we got word here in America that not only Russia is trying to interfere in the election, but now China is trying to interfere in the election. One side on the side of Donald Trump, and one side on the side of Vice President Joe Biden. So right now, the crazy thing is seeing how much meddling is going on, and seeing how much social media has become an influence for fake news, fake media, fake information. And now we're at a state, especially here in America, where you see Congress is arguing and fighting over, these social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook, and the way that they just allow information to be disseminated and not fact check it. Now we see them starting to fact check falsified information, because there was a time where Donald Trump was able to say whatever he wanted to say, and it wasn't fact checked. And now he has an issue with being fact checked, because the American people need to know that some of the things that he's saying isn't true, or it is incorrect. Honestly, with this election about to happen, there's going to be a lot of arguments over if this person truly won, if this person truly didn't win. Because if you look at Donald Trump, what he's saying as of now, right now, Donald Trump is already saying that we shouldn't have mail-in ballots. Yeah. Mail-in ballots will lead to voter fraud. And the American people on the other side, especially African Americans, are saying that we should have mail-in ballots because mail-in ballots is another form of voting. So
Indeed.
it's going to be really interesting.
Definitely a lot of issues definitely on at the forefront right now. We appreciate your time this morning, Dean, and for putting that all into context for us and sharing your expert insight with us. That was Dean, who was speaking to us there from Atlanta, Georgia this morning. These elections upcoming possibly will divide even further Americans, especially when it comes to their trust in government, right? Because we already have this mistrust of Donald Trump by certain portions of the American society about whether he colluded with Russia to win these elections over Hillary Clinton, who was a Democrat candidate at that time, back in 2016. But then also, as I put to Dean, is it really out of the normal realm of how things work in Washington to have countries try to lobby U.S. politicians? That's just how American democracy works, unfortunately, doesn't it? Where if you have the money, you'll have more influence over politicians. That's just how these things are built, unfortunately, where you have corporations, you have interest groups, who the more money you have, the more essentially you will have influence over foreign policy making or domestic policy making by the next White House, or the next person in the White House at least. So why not then also target the likes of AIPAC or others? I mean, or is this all legitimate? Is it fine for us to have the Israelis, the Russians, the Iranians possibly as well try to influence U.S. elections? We need to decide one way or the other. It can't be double standards for some countries and not for others. There should be a tightening of screws, in my personal opinion, over this issue of campaign financing, as well as just how and who around the world gets to influence who sits in the White House this year or in previous years as well. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss England. And within England, we've had, of course, Muslims, as well as other minorities, seemingly under the spotlight when it comes to the coronavirus pandemic, being blamed for its spread through practices which have been proven in such not to be true, in fact, that they've been gathering in mosques secretly during Ramadan. There was a lockdown that was placed just on the eve of this latest Eid that just passed by. A lot of this sort of stuff, again, pointing in the direction that Muslims probably, or possibly, I should say, in fact, are responsible for the spread of coronavirus and or other ethnic minorities in the country as well, the BAME community more specifically. We've also had a conservative MP, which has pretty much come out and said that quite explicitly, that at least within his constituency, he does think that it is the BAME community that is responsible for the spread of coronavirus there through not practicing social distancing, etc. Muslims, of course, would argue on the other end that they have, in fact, been responsible, that they're within mosques and etc. They have been practicing social distancing when the mosques did finally open, of course, or they were closed for quite a long time, and that they are being unfairly targeted. Muslim organizations in the UK have also expressed concerns about this sort of rhetoric, saying that essentially this is almost scapegoating a community at this time, where in fact all communities should be coming together, because all of the above affects everybody. It's not just about Muslims versus non-Muslims, or black versus white. Coronavirus affects everyone equally. And so this should, in fact, be bringing people together, not further dividing people along these sorts of ethnic lines as well. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. Now, joining Massoud Shadjareh, who is the chair of the Islamic Human Rights Commission. He's joining us from London. Joining us from Nottingham is Tom Vickers, who is a senior lecturer in sociology at Nottingham Trent University. He's also the author of Borders, Migration, and Class at an Age of Crisis, as well as Refugees, Capitalism, and the British State. And finally, joining us from Leeds is Zahed Amanullah, who is a resident senior fellow at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. Zahed, Tom, and Massoud, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Zahed, let me start with you. What do you make of these sort of conspiracy theories, right? And this has been happening from right at the beginning of the pandemic. There's always been this blame game on one or the other minority.
Absolutely. Well, this is something that myself and my colleagues at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue have been following since the pandemic surfaced in March, really in March with the lockdowns in Western countries. And for the most part, we've seen, an eagerness to blame individuals, particularly minority groups, for the spread of the virus. Early on, we saw memes online showing Muslims allegedly gathering in spite of lockdown orders, which were proven to be videos from past years and so forth, in an effort to blame Muslims. Remember, this is the lockdown that we're going through now. I'm only a few miles from one of the lockdown areas in Bradford, and this is the second time we've had a major holiday for Muslims during the pandemic. And during the first Eid after Ramadan, we saw compliance almost across the board. Now, this isn't to say that, of course, you don't have people who are not following the rules in every community. We certainly have that. And even in this lockdown, we've had two mosques, one in Bradford and one in Blackburn, shut down because of cases of coronavirus. The key is, are the measures in place to stop activities when they occur and put the right measures so that people are distancing and are preventing the spread? And Muslim organizations in the UK have come forward with guidelines to do this, and they're putting them in place.
Yeah. So, on that point, of course, as Zahed correctly said, of course, within every group, I'm sure there are those people who are possibly not respecting all the rules, right? But nevertheless, if we're going to start finger pointing, then there's also finger pointing at pubs and football fans gathering just recently as well after football games. I mean, there's no end to if you begin the finger pointing, right? This isn't a healthy way to go about dealing with the pandemic and how everyone should be respecting social distancing, certainly.
No, absolutely. I mean, the first thing I'd say is that I think the issue goes beyond the Conservative Party. So if you look at comments that the Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham from the Labour Party, that he said on the Today programme that he thinks that transmission's been caused partly by gatherings in multi-generational households. And when he was asked, did he mean predominantly the Asian population of Manchester, then he said, yes, I do mean that. So I think it is scapegoating, and it goes beyond the Conservative Party, and it's a very convenient diversion for the government from the actions of the state, how they've handled the crisis, which has been clearly prioritising the interests of business and capitalism and profits above human lives. So we've seen evidence of needless loss of life because of the lockdown being imposed late, priority being given to private contracts and outsourcing for the testing service rather than putting that money into the NHS, which has really fatally undermined the development of the testing capacity. We've seen older people being shipped out of hospitals and into care homes in order to stop hospitals being overwhelmed, and sometimes without those older people even being tested for COVID, and that contributing together with the inadequate PPE in a lot of privatised care homes to really horrific death rates, putting the blame onto individuals and in particular racialised minority communities is very useful for the government, and I think the government know that a lot of people will accept the blame being put onto Muslims because it plays to very long-standing racist ideas that are being promoted over years by a lot of the media and the government in Britain, linking racialised minorities with ideas of dirt and disease, and so it's all these long-standing racist ideas that have kind of primed people to accept this is a plausible explanation.
On that point that Tom just made there, Massoud, I wanted to go to you because this will have long-term impact beyond the pandemic too, right? Where if you have blamed certain minorities, and in this specific case, the Muslims of the UK, then you're going to always have then this mistrust narrative about them, won't you?
Yes, I think we need to recognize that this is really goes far beyond the epidemic and the virus crisis. We have been sort of using the politics of modernization in Europe and in Britain, and that's more or less mostly targeting the Muslim community, and that has created the environment of hate by the politicians, the media. I mean, every day for the last 10, 15 years. We are seeing ever increasing demonization and otherization of Muslim community and ethnic minorities in the West and Europe and so forth and so on. This is created the environment that anything happens, we actually kick into this sort of racist, Islamophobic agenda. And the sort of the COVID-19 has been yet again another sort of catalyst for these groups of people to come up and spread their venoms and demonization. And we need to be very careful, because the history shows us whenever we have actually created this sort of level of demonization, that demonization eventually has led either to ethnic cleansing or genocide. You know, you could, by creating this environment, which goes right the way across the society, then you prepare the society for acts of inhumane acts against one another. I mean, I'll give you the example of what happened in Bosnia in our recent history. You know, neighbors start killing neighbors. Neighbors start acting in such a barbaric way. Rape, killing children, etc., etc. And that environment of hate is the main contributor. We need to address that. It's not just the issue of this current crisis.
Right.
The crisis, the real crisis, is this sort of demonization, otherization, which all political parties and indeed the whole society is moving towards. And, you know, we are seeing that more fascism is actually sneaking into not just into Britain, but in Europe and Western societies.
Okay, Zahed, I wanted to bring you in because, you know, a lot of people look towards Boris Johnson, right? Especially when Craig Whitaker made that statement, the Conservative MP, about, you know, his own constituency and the BAME community and the Muslim community within his own constituency not respecting the rules. But Johnson chose not to condemn that statement, right? He essentially just said that, yeah, we want everyone to respect the rules, essentially sort of just deflecting and not really addressing the issue of targeting one specific community. That's problematic as well, right? Where then from the top down, top leadership down, we're not seeing a proper leadership to actually unite the country.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, every crisis is an opportunity to some people. And, you know, we've seen the Conservative Party take cues from the Republicans in the U.S., for example, in how dog whistles can actually provide political dividends. And you have there's no difference here in what's being said. I mean, if you look at statistics, the public health director at Trafford in Manchester, you know, in one of the lockdown areas, surveyed those who recently came down with the virus, and 80% of the 92% of the people that she surveyed were white middle class individuals. I mean, that completely goes against the narrative of minorities being the primary cause of transmission of this virus. So so the facts are there and the evidence is there, and Muslims, like every other group in society, are willing to go with the facts. I spoke to many people in Bradford, for example, where I had celebrations planned, and the vast majority of people I talked to said they were perfectly happy to comply if they had advance notice. The notice to lockdown was given at 9:30 p.m. in a tweet from Matt Hancock the day before Eid. You know, not in a press conference, not several days before, which they could have certainly if the data was showing that the possibility of increase was imminent. And that shows there is a willingness, a civic responsibility that Muslims are you know, willing to have if they're being treated with dignity as with the rest of society. And, you know, with regards to the government attitudes, I mean, it goes back to Dominic Cummings and what he did during lockdown. All of this erodes trust in government, but all of it provides political opportunities for those. And Dr. Vickers also, you know, brought up the contracts and so forth. It's the entire system of exploitation, you know, in a crisis when everybody needs professionalism and equal help against the transmission of COVID-19.
You know, Tom, I just can't get over the fact that none of the above really, right, helps actually defeat the pandemic, right, or lessen the virus spread. I mean, it just creates more divisions, but it doesn't really address the actual issues, right? Where you have, as we've all agreed, basically we've had people within every group possibly not respecting the social distancing rules or just the rules in general. And there needs to be more widespread education, more widespread understanding about the dangers that this may cause to respective members of anybody's loved ones as well. I wonder, though, why would the government at this time choose to allow this to happen? I mean, is this just political deflection? Do they not understand that this will not necessarily help the numbers in any way?
Yes, good question. I guess it's difficult to sort of guess what is going on in the heads of politicians making these decisions. I mean, yes, as I say, you can see it's politically convenient. I mean, you also have the kind of rhetoric from a lot of politicians that yes, we're all in this together, and we all need to follow the rules the same, but not recognizing how different sections of society have been, exposed and made vulnerable to this virus to very different degrees. And this is another huge issue that the government is not addressing. And it links this because blaming the behaviour of Muslims and other racialized minorities then also helps to deflect attention from the structural racism, which means that Muslims have been, among several groups that have been disproportionately affected by the virus, certainly if you look at death rates. But that's because of structural racism in society, and Muslims being disproportionately concentrated in frontline roles, often on low wages and very precarious terms, so that they're not in a position economically to stay home from work, even if they're in a vulnerable group, and much more likely to live in overcrowded housing because of poverty, and more likely to suffer from underlying health conditions that mean that they're more likely to be seriously ill if they do contract the virus. So yeah, it's another issue that blaming individual behaviour sort of serves the purpose for the government in diverting attention.
Yeah, Massoud, I wonder, as Tom there correctly pointed out, it's been said a number of times by many experts that, listen, we need to contextualize that a lot of Muslims and a lot of ethnic minorities in the UK and in other countries, of course, around the world also do work as frontline workers, right? Be they Uber drivers, nurses, the list is really endless, of course, janitors in schools, et cetera, and all of the above puts them in greater danger of possibly contracting this virus and possibly, of course, bringing it home. Nevertheless, that all needs to be dealt with. And then, we also have this issue of hospitals in those specific areas and whether they're as well equipped or not as hospitals in more affluent areas. What do you make of those issues and why those aren't being properly addressed?
Well, first of all, is a factual that overwhelming majority of people working in the national health are from ethnic minority, and there is a really tremendous contribution being made by Muslims in particular and other ethnic minorities in those structures. That without that, even the level of which is available now, which is inadequate because of the lack of resources, would not have been there. These are all facts. But the thing is this, that, when you get a popularist government that's incompetent of actually doing things, then is going to blame others and play the blame. This has been done in the United States by Trump and is being done in Britain by the Conservative Party currently. And because you don't have solutions, because you don't want to really address the problem. So it's much easier. Just let's blame the Muslims and the black community and ethnic minorities and people accept that. But this goes on and on and on, and it creates that environment of hate. I mean, I'll give you an example for the lockdown, which was forced just a few hours before Eid on Manchester and that area. I mean, it shows two things. It shows one thing that, to do such a thing in such a short notice when people are having a major event, it means that you are of their needs and their aspiration to come up with such a thing. So, Muslims are not in their parameter of thinking and considering. But also what it shows is that, they say that, you cannot go to each other's family and have family gatherings, but you could go to a restaurant. The same families could go to a restaurant or go to a pub. Abstraction. I mean, this is bizarre. This actually shows incompetence. This shows that, they're not really understanding the whole crisis and the way to work one's way through these crises. So, the same two families that cannot meet in their home, they could get up and go to a restaurant or a bar or a pub and infect more people or have a more chance of being infected. This is the sort of what we are getting day in, day out. And the reality is that's why the fact of the incompetence of politicians is contributing to this sort of bizarre demonization and the creation of environment of Islamophobia and racism.
Zahed, I'll give you the final word before the three of you go. Do you think the proper lessons are being learned here about how to prevent such pandemic spread in the future, towards social cohesion as well? Because, all of the above is very important, especially in a society like the UK, right, where you do have a lot of minorities who have been there for many generations, not just Muslims, of course. We've had many other minorities also in the spotlight here. The Black community, certainly, the East Asian community also, as we know, who has been targeted in many parts of the Western world also and scapegoated for the spread of the virus. Do you think that things are being learned by the top-down leadership at this time?
That's a very good question. I'm not sure. I mean, you mentioned East Asians. I mean, a counselor in Blackburn was suspended for actually blaming Chinese immigrants for the spread of the virus. So, I think this is something we're going to know when this pandemic has subsided somewhat. The important thing is that we keep receipts, that we make sure that we have evidence of the decisions that people made and why they were wrong, and have the strength and the allies to bring those up in the future when we have an inquiry, when this is all done, when we have a new plan for the next pandemic and can put these points forward. What's happening in the Conservative Party, the way that politicians are exploiting the crisis, I mean, that's existed for decades, that kind of instinct. We need to find political allies who understand these instincts and are willing to work for the betterment of all of our communities and who will fight against these instincts. That means more political involvement. That means more influence. That means more evidence being gathered to support our arguments. And it means building common cause with other minorities. Muslims have been, looking at what Chinese have been going through, what the Black community has been going through. They are our allies, and we need to make sure that we're all working together in the same direction instead of just looking after our own interests.
Very well. We'll leave it there at their final word, but we appreciate Zahed, Tom, and Massoud for their time today and for sharing their insight with us on this issue of, the targeting or scapegoating, I should say, more probably accurately, of Muslims and other ethnic minorities there in the UK for the spread of coronavirus. That's all factually incorrect, in fact. And nevertheless, as Massoud pointed out, the vast majority of NHS workers, as we know very clearly, are mostly minorities, and their contribution has been vital. Nevertheless, that's seemingly gone unrecognized by certain parts of UK politicians and establishment and society as well. The far right has tried to use the coronavirus pandemic, even in the US and other countries, especially in the Western world, to scapegoat further minorities in their respective communities, including Muslims and others. All of this just furthers hate, right? At a time where, in fact, you need more social cohesion, more unity between different communities, because this is, again, affecting all of us equally. Coronavirus does not, in fact, is not a prejudiced virus. It affects everyone equally, and that's something that all of the above need to understand as well. If politicians are seeking to use this as a deflection, that's only going to be to their own detriment, because this, again, will not affect the numbers. The numbers will remain the same. Whatever arguments they may want to put forth, it'll just hurt their own communities for the future. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.